There is a kind of darkness that does not announce itself with thunder or fire. It arrives in whispers, in the quiet moments between breaths, in the flicker of a doubt that grows until it devours even the mightiest of kings. Tonight, we step into the shadowed halls of Middle-earth, where one such ruler, a man crowned in gold and glory, would become something far more terrifying than he ever imagined. His story is one of pride, of power unchecked, and of a fall so profound it echoes across ages. But before we unravel the fate of the Witch King, Sauron's deadliest servant, let us pause for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Is the moon high in your sky, or is dawn just beginning to brush the horizon? Let us know in the comments below, because every great tale is better when shared, and yours is part of this journey too. Once, this king stood tall, his name spoken with awe from the marble towers of his city to the farthest edges of his realm. His people prospered, his armies were unmatched, and his will was law. But power, like a river, carves its own path, and beneath the surface of his triumphs, something darker stirred. It began with a rumor, a fleeting mention of a shadow rising in the east, of a lord who offered gifts beyond mortal reckoning. At first, he laughed. What could the darkness offer a king who already held the world in his grasp? Yet curiosity is a sly thing. It slips through the cracks of even the most steadfast resolve, and soon the whispers found their way to his throne. Then came the emissary, cloaked in secrets, bearing a gift that gleamed like starlight, but hummed with something far older. A ring, they said, forged for his hand alone. A token of alliance, a promise of strength, unending. Who could refuse such an offer? Not a king who had spent his life reaching for more. But here's the truth about gifts from the shadows. They are never freely given. Every bargain has its price, and his would be paid not in gold, but in soul. This is how a mighty king became the Witch King, how a ruler of men became a wraith bound to the will of darkness. And this is where his story truly begins. The moment the ring touched his finger, the king felt the world shift, not with a shudder or a crack, but with a slow, creeping certainty, like the first frost stealing over autumn leaves. The emissary's smile widened, though no warmth reached their eyes. Now, they murmured, "You are boundless," and for a breath he believed it. Strength surged through him, sharp as a blade, bright as a crown under the sun. His advisor's warnings faded to distant echoes, drowned out by the intoxicating whisper of the ring. His ring, promising empires unchallenged, years unending. But power is a mirror, and what it shows is never the whole truth. That first night, as he stood alone in his chambers, the king noticed something strange. The torchlight no longer cast his shadow upon the wall. He reached out, expecting to feel the warmth of the flames, but his fingers passed through the light as though it were mist. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The ring weighed heavier now, not on his hand, but on his soul. His people noticed the change before he did. The king who once rode among them, who laughed and feasted in their halls, now sat shrouded upon his throne, his voice grown hollow, his face hidden beneath a hood. Whispers spread. He no longer ate, no longer slept. Some claimed they saw him walking the battlements at dawn, though his footsteps left no mark in the dew. The advisors who had dared to question him vanished, one by one, their absences explained away with quiet, chilling finality. And then came the dreams. visions of a tower wreathed in flame, of a lidless eye that saw into the darkest corners of his mind. A voice, smooth as silk and sharp as a dagger, spoke to him in the silence between heartbeats. "You were meant for more," it murmured. "Kingship is a chain. Let me break it for you." Pride had blinded him to the cost of the bargain. Now, as the days blurred into years, the truth became unbearable. The ring did not grant power. It claimed it. Piece by piece, the man he had been was unraveling, his will bending toward a master he had never agreed to serve. The last flicker of the king's defiance came in a single, desperate act. He tore the ring from his finger and hurled it into the darkness, but the emissary was waiting. They lifted the ring from the dust, untouched by its malice, and pressed it back into his trembling hand. Too late, they whispered. "You are ours." The king fell to his knees, and when he rose again, he was no longer a king at all. At first, the ring's power felt like a blessing, an unstoppable tide lifting the king to heights no mortal had ever reached. His armies, already formidable, now moved with uncanny precision, their victories arriving swift and bloodless. Cities surrendered without a fight, their gates swinging open at the mere whisper of his approach. Even the earth seemed to bend to his will. Crops flourished in barren soil, storms parted around his borders, and his enemies' weapons turned to dust in their hands. For a time, the king believed he had cheated fate itself, but darkness never gives without taking. The first cracks appeared in his sleep. Visions slithered into his dreams, shadowed figures plotting behind his back, daggers gleaming in banquet halls, poison dripping into his wine. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his hand clenched around the ring, as if it alone could anchor him to reality. Soon, the dreams spilled into waking hours. A servant's hesitation became conspiracy. A general's thoughtful pause became mutiny. The king's once sharp mind, honed by years of rule, now saw betrayal in every shadow. His court grew uneasy. Advisors who had served him for decades found themselves accused on nothing more than a fleeting suspicion. The punishment for treason was always the same: a silent disappearance, a vacant seat at the council table, a family left to whisper questions that would never be answered. The kingdom's brightest minds either fled or fell, their absence leaving the halls of power eerily hollow, and the people, once proud to call him their protector, now hurried past the palace gates with heads bowed, as if even meeting a guard's gaze might mark them for the king's wrath. The festivals that had once lit up the city squares with music and laughter faded into memory. Streets that had thrived with merchants and storytellers now echoed with the heavy tread of armored boots. The ring's whispers grew louder, twisting his grief into fury, his loneliness into ruthlessness. "They fear you," it murmured. "Good. Fear is the only language the weak understand." Yet in rare, lucid moments, the king would stare at his reflection in the polished blade of a sword and barely recognize the hollow-eyed figure staring back. The ring had promised him strength, but it had stolen something far more precious: his trust, his joy, the very ties that had once bound him to his people. The kingdom still stood, its towers gleaming in the sun, but the light within had dimmed, and the king, though he would never admit it, had begun to wonder: was he ruling his land, or was the ring ruling him? The emissary returned not as a stranger cloaked in mystery, but as something far more terrible, a herald of the Dark Lord himself. No longer hiding behind veiled words, he spoke with the weight of Mordor behind every syllable. You were chosen, he said, fingers tracing the edges of his hood, as if savoring the revelation. Not for a petty crown of men, but for a throne that outlasts the stars. The king's chamber, once filled with the warmth of firelight, now seemed to swallow the flames, shadows stretching unnaturally toward the emissary's feet. For the first time since donning the ring, true fear pierced the king's heart. He reached for the dagger at his belt, but his hand trembled not from weakness, but from something worse. The ring hummed against his skin, pulsing in time with the emissary's voice, as if they shared a single breath. Resist if you wish, the emissary murmured, stepping closer. But the road ahead is already carved. You are the blade, and the Dark Lord is the hand that wields you. Then came the sound of rushing footsteps. The king's oldest friend, his most trusted captain, burst into the chamber, sword drawn. My lord, he gasped, eyes darting between the king and the shrouded figure. The eastern scouts, they've seen armies gathering under a black banner. This creature deceives you. For a heartbeat, the king wavered, the face of his friend, a man who had stood beside him since boyhood, who had laughed with him, bled with him, flickered like a candle in the wind. But the ring's whisper was louder. Treason, it hissed. Weakness. The king moved faster than thought. Steel flashed. A choked gasp filled the air as his friend staggered back, hands clutching at the wound spreading crimson across his tunic. The emissary's laughter was soft, approving. The king looked down at his blade, at the blood dripping onto the stones, and felt nothing. No grief, no remorse. Only a cold, creeping certainty. This was the first step. The last fraying thread of his humanity had snapped. His friend's dying words were not curses, but a plea. Remember who you were. The king turned away. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the distant echo of war drums. The emissary placed a hand on his shoulder. Now, he said, we begin. The body of his oldest friend had not yet grown cold when the first stones began to fall. The eastern horizon burned with the fires of Mordor's armies, their approach turning the sky the color of dried blood. In the streets below the palace, panic spread like a plague. Families dragged children through the chaos, their belongings clutched in shaking hands. Market stalls toppled, temples stood empty, and the great bell of the city, the one that had once rung in times of celebration, now told a single, ceaseless note of warning. The king stood at the broken window of his throne room, the wind tearing at his cloak. The ring on his finger no longer gleamed. It pulsed, a slow, sick rhythm that matched the drumbeats of the approaching host. He could feel the eyes of his remaining guards upon him, their loyalty fraying into something far darker. Fear, disgust, even hatred. One by one, they slipped away, until only the echoes of their footsteps remained. It was then that the emissary returned, stepping from the shadows as though he had always been there. No longer cloaked in false humility, he wore the livery of Barad-dûr, the sigil of the lidless eye, burning black upon his chest. You see now, he said, gesturing to the crumbling city below. This was never your kingdom. It was only ever a cage. The king wanted to rage to deny it, but the truth was written in the smoke rising from the homes of his people, in the silence where laughter had once lived. His hands, once strong enough to wield a sword or lift a goblet in toast, now trembled like an old man's. The ring had hollowed him, siphoned away everything but the fury that kept him upright. The emissary reached out, offering not a ring this time, but a crown twisted metal, jagged as a scream. "The Dark Lord gives you a new name," he whispered. Witch King, his right hand, his shadow upon the earth. Somewhere in the ruins, a child cried out for a mother who would never answer. The sound should have broken him. Instead, it ignited the last ember of his defiance, not for his people, not for the life he had lost, but for the raw, unyielding need to survive. He took the crown. And when he placed it upon his brow, the wind itself seemed to recoil. The walls of the throne room, already cracked with neglect, shuddered as though struck by an invisible fist. The king, no, the Witch King, now turned his face toward the east, where the armies of Mordor marched beneath banners of flame. The time of kings was over. The age of terror had begun. The wind howled through the shattered arches of the fallen palace, carrying with it the scent of ash and the distant screams of those who had once called him Lord. The Witch King knelt on broken stone, his armor once polished to a mirror's gleam, now pitted and dull, as though the darkness itself had gnawed at the metal. Before him, the air twisted, not with flame or smoke, but with something far more terrible, a presence vast and ancient, a will that pressed against the world like a boot upon a throat. Sauron did not show himself, not in any shape a mortal eye could recognize. He was the weight in the silence, the hunger in the shadows, the voice that slithered into the Witch King's mind without sound. "Speak your oath," it commanded, "and be remade." The words rose from the Witch King's lips, but they were no longer his own. They coiled like serpents, dripping with a malice that had festered in his heart for years. "By blood and shadow, I bind myself to you. Let my hand be your sword, my voice your whisper, my hate your will." As the vow echoed across the ruins, the ring on his finger burned, not with heat, but with a cold so deep it seared. The pain should have made him scream. Instead, he welcomed it. This was the final unraveling, the last thread of the man he had been snapping away. His flesh began to wither. Not with the slow decay of age, but with a terrible swiftness, as though time itself were clawing backward through his veins. The skin of his hands tightened, then cracked like parchment, revealing not bone, but something darker, a void where substance should have been. His breath, once steady and strong, became a rattling whisper, as if the air passed through him rather than within him. The weight of his armor grew unbearable, not because it had grown heavier, but because he had become less. Shadows pooled in the hollows of his face, his eyes fading into twin pits of endless night. And yet, he felt no fear. The ring's power, once a separate thing grafted onto his will, now pulsed through him like a second heartbeat. It was no longer a tool, it was his essence. The whispers that had tormented him for years now sang in harmony with his thoughts, their voices indistinguishable from his own. Where once he had resisted, now he embraced. Where once he had doubted, now he knew with chilling certainty. This was not an end, it was a beginning. When the transformation was complete, the Witch King rose. His body was no longer a thing of flesh and blood, but a wraith, a specter clad in the tattered remnants of his former glory. The air around him shuddered, as though the world itself recoiled from his touch. He flexed his fingers, watching as the darkness swirled between them like living smoke. The pain, the doubt, the fleeting memories of sunlight and laughter, all of it was gone. In its place was something purer, something absolute, The ruins of his kingdom stretched before him, but he felt no sorrow, no regret. These broken stones were not a grave, they were a pyre, and from their ashes he had risen, not as a ruler of men, but as Sauron's deadliest shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its cry sharp against the silence. The Witch King turned his face toward the east, where the towers of Mordor stood like black teeth against the horizon. His first steps as a wraith left no imprint in the dust. But his presence, that would be felt across all of Middle-earth, and the world would learn to tremble. The first city to fall was the one he had once called home. Its towers, which had glittered like gold in the sunlight when he ruled there, now stood as grim sentinels against the ash-choked sky. The Witch King rode at the head of his army, his black steed snorting flames, his very presence leaching the warmth from the air. The people who had once cheered his name now huddled behind crumbling walls, their prayers rising like smoke, but no god answered them that day. He remembered the baker who had slipped him honey cakes as a child, the weaver who had mended his banners with hands worn rough by decades of labor. Their faces flashed in his mind, clear as sunlight on water, but the ring's whisper was louder. "Mercy is for the weak," it hissed, "and you are no longer weak." The gates shattered like kindling beneath the fists of his war machines. His soldiers, once men of flesh and blood, now twisted creatures of shadow and steel, poured through the breach, their swords singing a song without pity. The Witch King did not dismount. He did not raise his blade. He simply watched as the streets ran red, as the great hall, where he had feasted and toasted his people's loyalty, became a tomb. A child darted from an alley, her eyes wide with terror, her small hands clutching a wooden toy. One of his captains moved to cut her down, but the Witch King lifted a single gauntleted hand. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then he closed his fist. The child's toy burst into black flame, and her scream was lost in the roar of collapsing stone. Word spread faster than fire. By the time the Witch King's host marched on the next city, its rulers had already fled, leaving their people to face his wrath. Those who remained barricaded themselves in temples, clutching makeshift weapons, their voices raised in desperate hymns. It made no difference. The walls wept blood where his wraiths passed through them, and the hymns turned to howls. The more the free peoples resisted, the more brutal his retribution became. A lord who dared to defy him was flayed alive, his skin stretched across the ruins of his own banner. A village that hid fugitives was drowned in a tide of tar-black spiders, their skittering legs the last sound its people ever heard. Yet in the rare moments between battles, when the screams faded and the ring's voice dimmed to a murmur, the Witch King would stare at his reflection in a pool of stagnant water and see nothing at all. No face, no past, only the void where a king had once been. The ring had promised him immortality, but it was a hollow kind of eternity, a life stripped of everything but purpose, a soul honed into a single, sharpened edge. By the time his campaign reached the white walls of Minas Ithil, the last great stronghold of men in the east, even the wind seemed to fear him. The city's defenders, proud knights in silver armor, lined the battlements, their swords gleaming in the moonlight. They shouted challenges, called him traitor, monster, abomination. The Witch King tilted his head, as if puzzled by their noise. Then he raised his hand, and the moon itself seemed to blink out. Darkness swallowed the walls. When the knight's cries turned to shrieks, He did not smile. He did not laugh. He simply turned his steed toward the next city, the next conquest, the next step in Sauron's grand design. For the first time in centuries, the gates of Minas Ithil creaked open, not to welcome allies, but to unleash nightmares. And as the Witch King crossed the threshold, the city's true name echoed in his wake like a death knell: Minas Morgul. Tower of black sorcery, stronghold of the damned, and his new throne. The command of the Nine was not given lightly. Sauron, whose will bent the very foundations of Middle-earth, chose his servants with the precision of a sculptor chiseling stone, each strike deliberate, each flaw exploited. When the Witch King knelt in the depths of Barad-dûr, the air thick with the stench of sulfur and despair, the Dark Lord did not speak. Instead, he stretched out a hand, not of flesh, but of shadow, and pressed it against the hollow where the Witch King's heart had once been. The touch seared like ice, and in that moment, 8 other figures materialized from the gloom, their forms flickering like candle flames in a draught. The Nazgûl, once kings, now wraiths. Their faces were lost to time, their voices reduced to whispers that could curdle blood, and now they were his. To lead the Nine was to wield a weapon sharper than any blade. They moved as one, their terror spreading like rot through the lands of men. Where the Witch King rode, crops withered in the fields. Where he whispered, villages emptied before dawn. His will became their command, his rage their purpose. Yet there was a hierarchy even among nightmares. Crumble, the shadow of the east, whose cruelty rivaled his own, tested the boundaries of obedience, until the Witch King silenced him with a single glance that sent the other wraiths recoiling. "You are not my equal," he murmured, the words slithering into Crumble's mind like serpents. "You are my tool, but power, even absolute power, is a hollow triumph when the soul is absent." In the rare lulls between slaughter, when the Nazgûl dispersed to the far corners of Mordor to carry out their master's will, the Witch King would stand alone on the battlements of Minas Morgul, the pale light of the cursed moon washing over his armor. And sometimes, only sometimes, a memory would surface, the scent of apple blossoms from the orchards of his youth, the sound of a lute playing in the courtyard on a summer evening, the weight of a crown that had not yet burned his brow. These fragments of a forgotten life would rise like bubbles from the depths of a stagnant pool, only to burst against the iron grip of the ring. The darkness did not tolerate weakness. It would coil around those fleeting thoughts, squeezing until they shattered into nothing. One night, as the Witch King gazed into the black waters of the Morgul Duin, he saw not his own reflection, but the face of the man he had once been. The vision lasted less than a heartbeat. With a snarl, he plunged his gauntleted hand into the river, scattering the image into ripples. When he withdrew his fist, the water that dripped from his fingers was not clear, but thick and dark as ink. The river itself seemed to recoil, its currents fleeing downstream as if poisoned. The Nazgûl felt the shift in their master's mood. They gathered behind him, their presence like a chill wind at his back. "The hour comes," the Witch King said, his voice the sound of a tomb sealing shut. "The free people still cling to their hope. Let us remind them why they should not." The wraiths hissed in unison, their excitement palpable, but as they turned to ride, the Witch King hesitated just for an instant. Beneath his helm, in the void where his face had been, something stirred. A ghost of regret, a phantom of remorse, it did not matter. The ring's voice drowned it out as it always did. By the time his steed's hooves struck the road, the moment was gone. And the 9 rode forth, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. The years blurred into centuries, and with them, the last remnants of the Witch King's humanity crumbled like ash in the wind. Sauron's defeat at the hands of Isildur had shattered the Dark Lord's physical form, but his will endured, and with it, the command that burned in the Witch King's hollow chest: find the ring. The One Ring, the masterwork of Sauron's power, had slipped from the fingers of its would-be destroyer and vanished into the shadows of Middle-earth. And so the hunt began. The Witch King's pursuit was relentless, a storm that swept across kingdoms, leaving frostbite on the hearts of those who crossed his path. Villages awoke to the sound of black riders in the dead of night, their breath like rotting mist, their voices hissing a single question in the minds of the terrified: where is it? Forests grew silent as he passed, birds falling mid-flight, their songs choked in their throats. Even the bravest warriors clutched their blades tighter when the wind carried the scent of decay, the unmistakable sign that the Witch King was near. But the ring eluded him. Whispers of its whereabouts taunted him like will-o' the wisps, a glint of gold in a riverbed, a rumor of a halfling's trinket in the Shire, a madman's babble in the alleys of Bree. Each lead turned to dust. With every failure, the Witch King's fury grew, but so too did the emptiness. Memories of his past life, his name, his face, the weight of a crown that had once been his own dissolved like smoke. What remained was not a king, not even a man, but a thing of pure malice, a blade honed for a single purpose. The Nazgûl, bound to his will, became extensions of his rage. They slithered through the cracks of the world, turning taverns into tombs, roads into nightmares. Yet for all their terror, the ring remained beyond their grasp. The Witch King's patience, already frayed by centuries of searching, wore thinner with each passing year. He could feel Sauron's impatience like a noose around his throat, the Dark Lord's voice slithering through the shadows: "You are failing me." And then, a spark, a whisper from the east, a name: Baggins, the Shire. The Witch King turned his steed toward the rolling green hills, the very air curdling at his approach. This time, there would be no mistakes. This time, the ring would answer to its master. But as he rode, a strange sensation flickered in the void where his heart had once been. Not doubt, never doubt, but something colder, sharper. The realization that even if he found the ring, even if he delivered it to Sauron's outstretched hand, there would be no triumph for him. Only more servitude, more hunger, more nothingness. The thought vanished as quickly as it came, drowned beneath the ring's ceaseless whisper: find it. Find it, find it. And so the specter of the king rode on, his cloak billowing like a funeral shroud, his wrath the only thing left to call his own. The white towers of Minas Ithil had stood for centuries, their marble walls glowing like captured moonlight, a defiant beacon against the shadow creeping from Mordor. But no light, no matter how pure, could withstand the tide that now surged against its gates. The Witch King did not ride at the head of his army. He was the storm itself. The very air turned to ice as he approached, his presence leaching the warmth from the stones, the breath from the lungs of the defenders who stood trembling upon the ramparts. They were brave, these knights of Gondor, their silver armor polished, their swords gleaming, but bravery is a flame, and the Witch King, was the wind that snuffs it out. The first wave of his forces crashed against the gates like a black tide, orcish hordes shrieking, their rusted blades thirsty for slaughter. Yet these were merely the distraction. High above, on the jagged peaks surrounding the city, darker shapes stirred. Winged beasts, their leathery hides stretched taut over bones like knives, circled like vultures sensing death. The Witch King raised a gauntleted hand, and the creatures dove, their screams shredding the night. One night, his banner bearing the white tree of Gondor loosed an arrow that struck true, but the beast did not falter. It plucked him from the wall as easily as a hawk takes a mouse, his cries lost in the cacophony of breaking stone. Minas Ithil's defenses had been designed to repel armies of men, not the nightmares that now scaled its walls. Wraiths in tattered robes flowed through the cracks in the masonry, their forms slipping between reality and shadow. Where they passed, torches guttered out. Where they breathed, men clutched their chests and fell, their hearts frozen mid-beat. The Witch King watched from below, his skeletal steed stamping impatiently. He could have joined the fray, could have carved his way through the gates with a single stroke of his cursed blade. But conquest is not merely about destruction, it is about despair. And despair requires witnesses. By dawn, the city's inner sanctum was breached. The last of the defenders, a handful of silver-clad warriors, formed a circle around their captain in the courtyard where children had once played. Their swords were chipped, their tabards stained with blood and sweat. The Witch King dismounted, his footsteps silent on the cobblestones. The captain spat at his feet. "You were a king once," he gasped. "What honor is there in this?" The Witch King did not answer. Honor was a word for the living. With a flick of his wrist, the captain's sword shattered, the shards embedding themselves in the throats of his men. The last thing the captain saw was the Witch King's gauntlet closing around his face, and then nothing. As the sun rose, its light did not touch Minas Ithil. The towers, once radiant, now stood cloaked in a sickly pallor, their stones weeping a luminous green mist. The very foundations groaned as if in pain, the earth rejecting what the city had become. The Witch King ascended the highest spire, the wind howling through the hollows of his armor. Below, his servants labored, not to repair, but to defile. The great library burned, its shelves of wisdom reduced to ash. The gardens, once fragrant with herbs and flowers, now sprouted thorned vines that writhed like serpents. And in the deepest vaults, where the city's healers had once stored their remedies, new horrors took shape, potions that twisted flesh, weapons that thirsted for souls. The Witch King turned his gaze east, toward the ashen plains of Mordor. Somewhere in the distance, the lidless eye watched, its approval a weight as heavy as chains. Minas Ithil was no more. In its place stood Minas Morgul, the tower of sorcery, a monument not to conquest, but to corruption. And from its poisoned heights, the Witch King would cast his shadow over all of Middle-earth. The world would learn to fear the pale glow of its walls, for when the moon caught those stones just right, they seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of something long dead, yet still hungry. The Witch King stood atop the ruins of a forgotten battlefield, the earth beneath his feet, still scorched from fires centuries cold. Here, where kings and commoners alike had fallen in waves, the air itself seemed to hum with unfinished vengeance. He raised his sword not to strike, but to carve symbols into the ashen wind, each mark glowing crimson before dissolving into the mist. The spell he wove was older than the kingdoms of men, dredged from scrolls buried beneath the black towers of Mordor. It called not upon the living, nor even the dead, but upon the refusal of the dead, those whose fury had outlasted their breath, whose rage had seeped into the very soil. At first, nothing stirred. Then the ground trembled, not with the force of an earthquake, but with something far worse, the slow, deliberate unclenching of spectral hands breaking free from graves long untended. One by one, they rose, warriors of ancient bloodlines, their forms flickering between flesh and shadow, their eyes burning with a light that was neither life nor death, but the terrible in between. The Witch King had expected obedience. What he received was silence, heavy and accusing. The dead men did not kneel. They stared at him, their hollow gazes stripping away the layers of his armor, his power, his very identity, until only the truth remained. He was no different from them. A king who had gambled his soul and lost. Their whispers slithered into his mind, not in the black speech of Mordor, but in the languages of their lost homelands, tongues he had once known in another life. "You wear chains of your own making," one murmured, its voice the creak of a gallows rope. "We are bound by your will, but you are bound by his." The Witch King recoiled. For the first time in centuries, something akin to doubt prickled beneath the numbness. He crushed it swiftly, his will flaring like a whip of black fire. The dead men shuddered, their forms twisting in agony, but the spell held. They would obey. Yet as they marched at his command, their spectral feet leaving no mark upon the earth, their whispers did not cease. They spoke of the wives they had left weeping, the children who had grown old waiting for fathers who would never return. They spoke of the sun and how its warmth had felt upon their skin. Their words were weapons no armor could deflect. The Witch King threw them into battle after battle, their ghostly blades cutting down armies with ease. Men fled at the sight of them, their courage crumbling like rotted wood. But with every victory, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You think yourself their master." A dead king hissed as he slit the throat of a sobbing soldier. "You are only the leash that yanks us forward. The hand that holds it is not yours." In the quiet hours, when even the Nazgûl kept their distance, the Witch King would find himself listening to the echoes of those voices. They did not speak of glory or conquest. They spoke of a single, relentless truth. The dead were not afraid of him. They pitied him, and that was a torment no spell could silence. The words slithered through the ranks of Mordor's armies like a poison, carried on the lips of prisoners dragged from ransacked villages. "No living man may hinder him," the seer had gasped, her chains clinking as she trembled before the Witch King's throne. Her face was gaunt, her eyes milky with visions, but her voice held a terrible clarity. The Nazgûl had hissed, their spectral forms recoiling as if struck. Yet the Witch King merely tilted his head, the rusted hinges of his helm creaking with emotion. Then he laughed, a sound like a sword dragged over bone. "No living man," he echoed, the words dripping with mockery. "Then I have nothing to fear." But the prophecy did not fade. It clung to him, a burr in the folds of his shadow, whispering in the silence between battles. He crushed it beneath his will, as he had crushed every other weakness. His campaigns grew more brutal, his victories more absolute. Entire regions fell to his wrath, their names erased from maps, their histories were written in ash. The seer's words were not a warning, he told himself. They were a challenge, and he would answer it with such overwhelming terror that no one would dare speak of fate again. Yet in the rare moments when the slaughter paused, when the screams faded and the ring's voice dimmed, the Witch King found himself staring at the hands that had once wielded a scepter, now gauntlets housing only void. No living man, the phrase taunted him. Did it mean no man at all, or was there some loophole, some trick hidden in the words? The doubt festered, a splinter in his certainty. He ordered the seer's village put to the torch, her kin hunted down one by one. But prophecies do not burn, they breathe. His lieutenants noticed the change. Crumble, ever the opportunist, tested the boundaries of his command, only to find the Witch King's retaliation swifter and crueler than before. A lesser wraith who dared to question him was unmade, his essence scattered like dust on the wind. The message was clear. Doubt would not be tolerated, not from them, not from himself. Still, on the eve of battle, as he stood atop the walls of Minas Morgul, watching the moon's sickly glow, the Witch King's fingers twitched toward the hilt of his sword. Somewhere in the darkness, the seer's voice seemed to murmur again. No living man. He clenched his fist until the metal groaned. Let the free peoples cling to their prophecies. Let them whisper of hope. He would prove them all wrong, even if he had to drown the world in blood to do it. The War of the Ring began not with a single battle, but with a slow, suffocating dread that crept across Middle-earth like a fog. Fields once golden with harvest withered overnight. Rivers ran black with ash, and in the east, the sky burned red as Mordor's forges worked without ceasing, forging weapons for an army vast enough to drown the free peoples in sheer numbers. At the head of this tide of darkness rode the Witch King, his armored form a silhouette against the flames, his presence leaching the warmth from the very air. Where his steed's hooves touched the earth, grass crumbled to dust. Where his shadow fell, even the bravest hearts faltered. This was not war as men understood it, not clashing armies meeting on open fields with honor and banners. This was annihilation. The Witch King's strategies were cruelly precise, his tactics designed not just to defeat, but to break. Villages were not merely conquered, they were made into examples. Survivors fled with tales that turned stomachs and shattered resolve. Entire families entombed alive, forests set ablaze with creatures trapped inside, prisoners forced to wield swords against their own kin. Fear was his weapon, and he wielded it with a craftsman's skill. Yet amid the carnage, something strange stirred in the hollow where the Witch King's heart had once been. A flicker, faint as a dying ember, but undeniable. The ring on his finger, the very source of his power, had always whispered to him, its voice a constant companion in the centuries of servitude. But now, for the first time, he heard the words beneath the words. You were never meant to rule, it murmured, only to clear the path for another. The realization should have enraged him. Instead, it settled like a stone in the pit of his void. He crushed the thought swiftly, burying it beneath fresh atrocities. At Minas Ithil, his siege engines reduced the White City's proud walls to rubble. His winged beasts darkened the sky, snatching riders from their saddles mid-charge. And when the gates finally fell, it was the Witch King who strode through first, his mace shattering shields like kindling, his very breath spreading panic like a plague. Yet even as the defenders broke and ran, their cries of terror ringing in his ears, The doubt returned, sharper this time. Why fight for a master who had stripped him of everything? His name, his face, even the memory of sunlight on his skin. The ring's answer was immediate, venomous, because without me, you are nothing, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all. The Witch King had once been a king. Now he was a weapon, a blade forged by Sauron's hand, with no will beyond the hunger for more destruction, more suffering, more proof that the darkness had claimed him completely. Then came the Pelennor fields, the clash of steel, the screams of horses, the stench of blood and burning flesh, and her, a shield maiden of Rohan, standing defiant atop a mound of corpses, her sword raised not in desperation, but in challenge. The Witch King hesitated. No living man could hinder him, so the prophecy went. But she was no man. For the first time in centuries, something akin to fear prickled in the void of his being. The ring shrieked in his mind, urging him forward. Yet as he advanced, his blade dripping with the blood of countless victims, the Witch King realized with icy clarity, this was not his war. It had never been, and then the blade fell not his, but hers, and as the darkness rushed in, the last thing he heard was not the roar of triumph, but the silence of a question left unanswered. What if I had chosen differently? The Witch King's armor collapsed, empty. The ring that had bound him for millennia rolled into the mud, its gold dull, its whispers finally still. Across the battlefield, the armies of Mordor faltered. For the first time in an age, the sun broke through the clouds, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of mortal memory, the ghost of a king, not a wraith, not a monster, but a man, took his first unshackled breath. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of the Witch King's steed as he led the charge across the Pelennor fields, the air thick with the stench of burning pitch and the metallic tang of blood. Minas Tirith's white walls, once unbreakable, now smoldered under the relentless assault of Mordor's siege engines. His armies surged forward like a black tide, their war cries mingling with the screams of the dying. The Witch King himself was a storm of shadow and steel, his mace crushing shields and skulls with equal ease, his very presence turning seasoned warriors into trembling wrecks. This was his hour, the culmination of centuries of conquest, the moment when all of Middle-earth would kneel before the terror he had become. Then, amid the chaos, a glint of defiance caught his eye. A lone rider, clad not in the livery of Gondor's knights, but in the armor of Rohan, stood atop a mound of fallen soldiers. Her golden hair streamed like a banner in the wind, her sword raised high. The Witch King paused, his hollow gaze fixed on her. She was no seasoned general, no legendary warrior, just a woman, her face streaked with dirt and determination. Yet something in her stance, in the unwavering fire of her eyes, sent a ripple through the void where his soul had once been. The prophecy slithered through his mind like a serpent. No living man may hinder me. The words had always been a taunt, a reminder of his invincibility. But now, for the first time, they felt like a noose tightening around his neck. This was no man. This was Éowyn, shield maiden of Rohan, and the fear that flickered in the Witch King's chest was not of death, it was of irrelevance. What if all his power, all his centuries of terror, meant nothing in the face of a single act of courage? The ring on his finger screamed at him to strike her down, to prove once, and for all that no defiance could touch him. He raised his mace, the cursed blade at his side, humming with hunger, but as he advanced, something shifted. The battlefield seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them locked in a silence heavier than any armor. Éowyn did not flinch. She met his gaze, her voice cutting through the din like a knife. "I am no man," she said, and the words struck deeper than any blade. Then came the pain, not the searing agony of steel, but the slow, dawning horror of realization. Her sword pierced his spectral form, not with brute force, but with something far more devastating: truth. The Witch King staggered, his armor crumbling like dry parchment, the darkness that had sustained him for centuries unraveling at the seams. The ring's whispers turned to shrieks, then to silence. As the last of his form dissolved into the wind, a final thought flickered through the void, not of rage, not of triumph, but of something achingly human. "Remember who you were," and then nothing. The Witch King was gone, but in the quiet that followed, as the sun broke through the ash-choked sky, the world breathed a little easier. The shadow had passed, and somewhere, perhaps, the ghost of a king finally found rest. The scream tore through the battlefield like a storm breaking, a sound not of pain, but of pure, unmaking fury. The Witch King's blade clattered to the earth, his gauntlets grasping at the emptiness where his body had been, as if he could claw his way back into existence. The prophecy had been a riddle wrapped in shadow, and now it unraveled him with cruel precision. "No living man," the words echoed as his form frayed, tendrils of darkness peeling away like ash from a dying fire. For a heartbeat, the weight of centuries lifted, the battlefield vanished, the stench of blood and burning pitch faded. He stood again in a sunlit courtyard, the scent of apple blossoms thick in the air, the laughter of children ringing from some unseen garden. A face flickered in his mind, his own, but younger, unlined by time or torment. He had been a king once, not a wraith, not a weapon, a man who had ruled with pride, who had knelt in temples and sworn oaths to protect his people. The memory was a spark in the void, bright and unbearable. Then the darkness rushed back. The ring's voice, silent for that single, fleeting moment, returned with a shriek. "You are mine." The Witch King's scream turned to a howl of denial, not at death, but at the realization he had been given one last chance to remember, and it had come too late. His armor collapsed, empty. The specter of the king dissolved into the wind, his final thought not of Sauron, not of the wars he had waged, but of the weight of a crown he had once worn willingly. On the battlefield, Éowyn staggered back, her sword still raised, her breath ragged. The air where the Witch King had stood shimmered, not with the residue of dark magic, but with something quieter, an echo, perhaps, of the man who had been lost long before this day. Around her, the armies of Mordor faltered, their ranks dissolving into chaos. The sun, hidden for days behind smoke and storm clouds, broke through the gloom. And somewhere, beyond the reach of mortal sight, a shadow passed from the world, not with a roar, but with a sigh. The Witch King was gone, but in that last fractured moment, the king had returned. Just long enough to know what he had sacrificed, just long enough to grieve. Echoes linger longest in the places where shadows once fell heaviest. In the taverns of Gondor, mothers hushed their children with warnings of the Witch King's name, and in the ruins of Minas Morgul, the very stones seemed to whisper of his passing. But beneath the layers of fear and legend, there's another story, one that begins not with a monster, but with a man, a king who once walked in sunlight, whose laughter echoed in halls now reduced to dust. They say power corrupts, but corruption is rarely a single misstep. It's a slow descent, a path paved with choices that seem small at the time. The king didn't wake one morning and decide to serve darkness. He was lured first by ambition, then by pride, and finally by the seductive promise of a gift that would make him invincible. The ring didn't force his hand, it simply showed him what he already desired. And that's the true tragedy of his story. The Witch King wasn't born in Mordor. He was made, piece by piece, from the shattered remnants of a ruler who believed he could outwit the darkness. Yet even in his final moments, as Éowyn's blade struck true, there was a flicker of something long buried. A memory, perhaps, of the man he'd been before the ring's whispers drowned out his own voice. Could he have turned back? The question haunts the quiet corners of Middle-earth, where scholars and storytellers debate in hushed tones. Some argue his fate was sealed the moment he accepted Sauron's gift, that no one can bargain with shadow and emerge unscathed. Others whisper of alternate paths, a king who might have broken the ring's hold had he found the strength in time. But history is written by the victors, and the Witch King's legacy is one of terror. His name is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of unchecked hunger. Few pause to wonder about the man behind the legend, the ruler who once planted trees, whose roots still cling to life beneath the cursed soil of Minas Morgul. Perhaps that's the greatest cruelty of all, not just what he became, but what was lost along the way, and so the stories endure, twisted by time and fear. The Witch King rides no more, but his shadow lingers not just in the places he ruined, but in the unspoken question that lingers like mist after rain. How thin is the line between a king and a monster? And who among us might cross it, given the right temptation? The story of the Witch King lingers like smoke from a dying fire, a tale not just of terror, but of the slow unraveling of a soul. His downfall wasn't written in a single act of betrayal or a moment of weakness. It was carved into history, one choice at a time, each seemingly small, each whispering promises of power just out of reach. Pride made him reach for more, ambition made him grasp it, and by the time he realized the cost, his hands were already stained with the very darkness he'd believed he could control. There's a chilling lesson in his story, one that echoes far beyond the borders of Middle-earth. Power doesn't always corrupt with a roar. Sometimes it's a quiet thing, a nudge toward compromise, a shrug at cruelty, a lie swallowed because it's easier than facing the truth. The Witch King didn't wake one day and decide to become a monster. He simply stopped recognizing the line between ruler and tyrant. The ring didn't force his hand. It only showed him what he was already willing to do. And yet, buried beneath the layers of myth and fear, there's a glimmer of something else, a reminder that before he was the Witch King, he was a man. A king who planted trees whose roots still cling to life in the poisoned soil of Minas Morgul. A ruler who once stood in the sunlight, his crown heavy with duty, his heart unbroken. That's the true tragedy of his story, not just what he became, but what was lost along the way. We tell tales of villains to make sense of the darkness, to draw lines between good and evil, as if they're carved in stone. But the Witch King's legacy is a warning written in shadow. The line between hero and monster isn't a chasm. It's a slope, slippery and subtle, and every step down feels justified until you're too far gone to climb back. So the next time you hear his name, don't just shudder at the specter of the Witch King. Remember the king he was, and the choices that unmade him, because darkness doesn't always come knocking. Sometimes it's invited in.